We continue our story of the sale with the knowledge of the Carter situation that Don Page could not possibly have at this point. We know the Carters were definitely interested in a Cadillac. But without this knowledge, Don Page had just about decided to give up on Mr. Carter. What prospect was worth that much time and effort anyway? Wouldn't it be better to concentrate on somebody else? Alone on the floor at dinner time, Don had time to think. He hated to give up, so he kept turning the facts over and over in his mind. He remembered how the whole thing had started with a story of a graduation party at the Greenwood Club. From this, the trail had led to a well-to-do manufacturer who drove a Lincoln. Don also knew where Mr. Carter lived and something about his family. He also knew he had been unable to locate a mutual friend as a point of reference. Apparently, Mr. Carter moved in a circle of his own. So, what next? Finally, he decided to give it another try. Now, the way he went about it may not be what you and I would do, but perhaps we can get some good tips by observing how he got the sale off dead center. But let's let Don tell the story himself.
I'd called Mr. Carter's office without success. Even though I know that most people don't like to be disturbed at the dinner hour, I decided to give it a try. When I dialed their number, Mrs. Carter answered.
Mrs. Carter speaking. Who's calling, please?
This is Don Page of Kentwood Cadillac, Mrs. Carter. Could I speak to Mr. Carter, or are you having dinner?
No. Just a minute. It's for you, Charles.
Who would call me at this hour?
His name is Page. Says he's from Kentwood Cadillac. That's a new Cadillac place out on the boulevard where Mrs. Harris got her car. You know.
What does that have to do with it?
Really nothing, dear, but I thought you might just speak to this man.
Of course I'll speak to him. Have him call me at my office after 10 tomorrow.
When I called Mr. Carter at his office the next day, he didn't warm up very much. But I did learn he had taken a cab to the office while his car was in for a brake job. So, when I offered to drive him home, he agreed, and I picked him up at his office. This not only gave me a chance to explain some of the outstanding features of the Cadillac, but when I let him take the wheel, he started asking me all kinds of mechanical questions. Does a 4-barrel carburetor eat gas? What about the horsepower? What type front-end suspension? And so on. By the time we got to his house, I was sure glad I'd studied my data book. Seems he had worked on racing cars in his young days and was an absolute bug on machinery. For this reason, it was easy to keep the conversation going right into the house, and what a break that was for me. He just couldn't wait to tell Mrs. Carter how easy it was to adjust the 6-way seat. While he was telling her about power steering, shorter turning radius, and all that, I just let him have fun and quietly agreed with everything he said. I could see Mrs. Carter wasn't too interested, but that she did want a Cadillac. Plastics being his business, he wanted to know how many plastic parts there were in a Cadillac, and for the life of me, I couldn't tell him. I thought the conversation was going to get clear out of hand until I started talking about Cadillac finishes and started showing Mrs. Carter our color and trim book. Did you ever see a woman who wasn't fascinated by a swatch of exceptionally beautiful fabric? Just ask any interior decorator. I told her to keep the book and take her time about picking out colors and fabrics. Still, I reminded her it was the only one I had, and that if she couldn't bring it in, I'd arrange to pick it up. But it was getting late, and when I learned they planned to pick up their car that evening, I suggested they drive mine and bring it in later. What I really wanted was for Mrs. Carter to use it the next day. So I walked to the corner and took the first bus back to town. I was really pleased with myself, thinking I had another one pretty well on ice. They took a ride in the Cadillac, all right, just as I wanted. But as I said, this man Carter was something to reckon with. After he had put the car through its paces and was pretty well satisfied with the performance, he stopped to pick up his Lincoln and let Mrs. Carter drive my Cadillac back home. Then, before he paid his bill, he hunted up the sales manager and got an estimate on what it would take to put him in a new Lincoln. They appraised his car immediately, and he had all the figures before he went home. And as for me, I'm glad I didn't know about all this until later, because the way it was, I turned out the lights, went home, had a good night's sleep. So when they came in late the next afternoon, I concentrated on the car and my styling presentation to Mrs. Carter. I figured he would buy her anything she wanted, and I was right, but only up to a point. I gave her my best presentation about the matchless beauty of the Cadillac with classic styling that made it the most imitated automobile in the world. I suggested a sedan DeVille because it would be easier for her many friends to get in and out of the rear seat. First, she mentioned green, but I found she liked any color just so it was pink, and we settled on Mountain Laurel. Once this was decided, we had no trouble deciding on interior trim. The lady had good taste, anyone could tell that. She was fascinated with the luxurious appointments of the Cadillac, and while she was looking at the cars, I kept selling her on safety and convenience features, like the new wide-pendant brake pedal. Mr. Carter wanted to know what made the signal-seeking radio work, and all I could do was to assure him that it did work beautifully, but it would take a radio man to explain the principle in detail. It was easy to see he was fascinated with every mechanical feature of the car, from the power windows to the remotely operated trunk lock. He even played with the electric radio antenna like a kid with a new toy. While all this was going on, our appraiser had gone over Mr. Carter's car and had the figures ready for me, just in case I needed them. So when we were ready to sit down and talk, I had all the information. One of the best ways I know of to close a sale is to assume the customer is going to buy. So now that I had a good idea what they wanted, I invited Mr. and Mrs. Carter into the closing room. I knew they wanted a sedan DeVille. I knew the color and fabric. Heater and radio, of course. Tinted glass? Yes. Six-way seat? By all means. Fog lamps? Sure. Headlight dimmer? Yes. Air conditioning? No. And so it went. When I got it all added up, I told Mr. Carter what it would cost. He wanted to know how much we'd allow for his Lincoln, so I explained our appraisal procedure to him. Then I figured the difference for him. Well, with that, Mr. Carter seemed to have some question in his mind. He said he and Mrs. Carter would talk it over, and he'd let me know. I had that sinking feeling we all get now and then, but I kept the conversation going by saying I had some figures I thought he'd be interested in. I told him if our appraiser found his car in top condition, we would be offering him the going price of his Lincoln on the market, and proved my point by showing him an advertisement from a local paper that quoted the current price of a car like his. What's more, I showed him auction prices that proved he would now be way ahead had he purchased a Cadillac at the time he bought his Lincoln. You see, Mr. Carter, any way you look at it, it should cost you less to own this Cadillac because you have more value to start with. Any way you look at it, you'll be ahead. And while your investment is being protected year after year, you enjoy the luxury, performance, and prestige that comes only with Cadillac ownership. Now, Mrs. Carter wants this car, doesn't she?
Well, we've agreed to buy a new car.
Well, then why not get her the car she's always dreamed of owning? You know, there's no real reason you shouldn't. When Mr. Carter said, "All right, Mr. Page," well, from then on, it was only a question of getting a deposit and confirming a delivery date. And so I was on my way to adding another owner to my growing clientele.
So before continuing with our story of a sale, let's review the principal steps leading to Mr. Carter's final decision. Once Don had picked up the lead on Mr. Carter from the society page, he made it his business to know all he could about the prospect and to sell the appointment by telephone. As we observed, getting the appointment required considerable persistence. Driving the prospect home from work gave Don an opportunity to demonstrate the car and answer all kinds of technical questions. Without a working knowledge of the data book, the sale might have ended right there. Once in the home, Don concentrated on styling, lustrous colors, rich fabrics, and luxurious interior appointments with excellent results. Women can't resist these features of the Cadillac. In the showroom, Don helped his prospect select the car best suited to her needs, in this case, a sedan DeVille. And in this process, he sold styling, color, and appointments all the way. Don also explained the features of the car to Mr. Carter, knowing that the decision to buy often rests on some feature that may have unusual appeal to the prospect. When the right time came, Don assumed the customer was going to buy and tried for a close. We all have our own way of doing this, and more often than not, we can close a sale at this point, depending on our experience, skill, and the disposition of the prospect at the time. In writing up the order, we find it wise to present all facts, including all optional equipment, accessories, taxes, and license. We know that nothing irritates a customer more than a misunderstanding regarding price. When the sale is not closed at once, and even when the customer continues to say no, we follow up the prospect and try for another appointment at his home or office. Across the board, Cadillac sales are seldom quick sales. Experienced Cadillac men keep right on closing at every opportunity by convincing the prospect he'll have more performance, luxury, prestige, and motoring enjoyment than he's ever known before. With Cadillac, it's far more effective to sell the car rather than the deal. No matter what closing technique you use, one of the best ways is to sell the inherent value of Cadillac ownership. But let's return to Don Page and his story, and let him tell us what he makes of doing when the customer comes for his Cadillac. Here, the business of sound customer relations really begins.
First of all, I told Mr. Carter his car was in perfect order and all ready to go. Having the car ready on time is absolutely essential in our business, as we all know how a customer will react when there's a delay at this point. I always introduce my customers to Harry Hilton, our service manager, and Harry assures them they will get every consideration when they come in. If Harry's not too busy, I let him explain the warranty and service policy. I also make sure the customer understands that the service policy is good at any Cadillac dealership in the country, and show him the owner's card. This card assures him of red carpet treatment from all dealers, even when the car is out of warranty. Then we get in the car, and I take all the time necessary to explain the operation of the car, from the hydromatic drive to heater controls, lights, trunk lock, and everything else, making absolutely certain he understands it. The faster he gets used to the car, the better he will like it. I also told Mr. Carter all about the seat adjustment, rear door safety locks, and remote control trunk lid lock. I even called his attention to the cigar lighters, lighted ashtrays, and glove compartment light. When a man buys a Cadillac, he wants to know all about it. By the time we were through, Mr. Carter was as pleased and proud as he could be. He already felt the car was his, and when I presented the final appraisal, he was more than ready to complete the transaction. As he was ready to drive away, I suggested he have Mrs. Carter drive in later so I could explain the car to her. He said that should not be necessary, and I could see that he wanted to have the fun of doing that. Then I reminded him that my personal card was in his warranty book and suggested he look me up when he brought his Cadillac in for inspection. Told him I'd like to have him meet my boss, Mr. Kent, at the first opportunity. That pleased him, and he drove away. After that, I would call his home periodically to see how he was getting along with his new car. After all, he was now my customer. I was going to look out for him. During this process, he gave me the names of several associates who admired his car. And as everybody knows, these customer referrals are the best prospects in the world. After that, I called Mr. Carter at the end of 6 months, and on the first anniversary of his Cadillac ownership. By this time, he and I had become well acquainted with the kind of relationship that pays real dividends. In fact, I know that one of these days when I call Mr. Carter, he's going to say,
Say, Don, Sarah and I are driving to the coast this year, and Sarah thinks we should have a new car before we go. Why don't you stop at my office and tell me what you would recommend?
And do you think I'll be late for that appointment? Want to bet?